If you are lost in the Appalachian woods after midnight and you hear someone knocking on your cabin door, count them. 1, 2, 3. If it stops, you are safe. But if there is a fourth knock, do not look at the windows. It's already inside. Urban explorers Sam and Leo rented an isolated cabin deep in the Blackwood National Forest, specifically to test that rule. They were shooting content for a mystery podcast, entirely convinced that the local legends surrounding the so-called Whispering Woods were fabricated to drive up tourism. To understand what went wrong, you have to look at the baseline conditions of their environment. Inside the cabin, they are surrounded by the constant, deafening roar of a heavy rainstorm. The wind is violently swaying the pine trees outside. That relentless wall of white noise creates a false sense of security, masking any subtle movements in the brush. Dismissing generations of regional folklore as a cheap tourist trap under the guise of modern skepticism is the first mistake victims make in these woods, and usually it is a fatal one. The escalation begins with a sudden, impossible environmental shift. The lights inside the cabin violently flicker and die. But worse, the storm instantly stops. There is no rain hitting glass. There are no crickets. The forest goes completely, terrifyingly quiet. This chart shows the auditory concept of the vacuum phase. We see a sudden sheer drop in ambient decibel levels, plunging from heavy environmental noise down to absolute zero. The human biological reaction to this instantaneous deprivation of sound is immediate panic and severe disorientation. That sudden absence of sound is not a meteorological anomaly. A storm doesn't just evaporate in a single second. It is a deliberate, highly effective isolation tactic utilized by the predator in the woods to strip its prey of their situational awareness. Total silence in the Appalachian woods is the ultimate red flag. It confirms the entity has successfully established a perimeter, isolated its prey from the outside world, and officially initiated the hunt. The entity does not charge blindly into the cabin. It studies you. It utilizes an initial observation phase, clinging to the shadows and watching through the glass to identify the vulnerabilities of the people inside. Once it understands the dynamic, it deploys a technique called echolocative corruption. The creature listens to the conversations happening inside the cabin, perfectly stealing the cadence, tone, and emotional pitch of a familiar human voice. The entity executes this corruption by projecting the replicated voice right outside the heavy cabin door. It cries out. It begs to be let in. It sounds exactly like someone you trust, shivering in the cold, pleading for help. The terror stems from the sheer physical impossibility of the scenario. Sam hears Leo screaming in absolute agony from the other side of the heavy wooden door, while the real Leo is standing right next to him inside the room, holding a flashlight in pure terror. The entity prioritizes psychological fracturing over brute physical force, weaponizing human trust to dismantle a victim's sanity from the inside out. Faced with two identical voices, one standing beside them, one begging for its life in the dark, the victim's brain hits a psychological breaking point. The cognitive dissonance of processing an impossible reality leaves them frozen and vulnerable. This logic flowchart maps the mimicry trap. An auditory stimulus connects to an instinctual empathy node, leading to the fatal action of opening the door. A conscious survival protocol must interrupt this instinct, severing the pathway, forcing the victim to maintain the physical barrier. When the entity realizes the trick has failed, the crying stops instantly. There is no fade-out, just a jarring, immediate cessation of sound, leaving a tense, empty void in the exact spot where the psychological assault was happening seconds prior. Surviving that psychological assault does not mean the prey has escaped. Refusing to open the door simply forces the entity to abandon its manipulation and transition to a direct physical siege. Heavy thuds begin to echo through the entire cabin. Knock, knock, knock. The heavy wooden door violently vibrates in its frame from the sheer force of 3 massive, deliberate impacts. The ancient Appalachian rule states you must count them. 1, 2, 3. The conditional promise of the folklore is that if the impacts stop at 3, the structural boundary holds, and you are entirely safe. Following the third knock, total stillness returns to the cabin. The immediate threat seems to dissipate, and a wave of premature, exhausting relief washes over the victims. They followed the rules. They survived the night. But relying on predictable, rigid rules is a massive vulnerability when dealing with a predator capable of intelligent spatial subversion. The folklore provides a false sense of security right when the entity is repositioning. The silence is finally broken by a slow, heavy fourth knock. It violates the expected spatial boundary. It doesn't come from the front door, and it doesn't come from the windows. The impact echoes directly from the wooden ceiling above their heads. Tilting the flashlight up reveals a pale, faceless creature clinging upside down to the interior roof, staring directly down at them. In the perfect replication of Leo's voice, it delivers one final phrase. "I told you. Don't look up." The entity strikes, instantly dropping from the ceiling and collapsing the distance between predator and prey. This exact sequence mirrors the chilling reality of dozens of unsolved missing persons reports buried deep in the archives of Appalachian local law enforcement. Cabins found empty, doors locked from the inside, and severe structural damage to the interior roofs. Appalachian folklore functions as a series of blood-written survival protocols, challenging you to consider if you possess the mental discipline to survive the subversion of the fourth knock.